instituted, while Frank Thomas instituted the only PhD program in prophetic preaching and sacred rhetoric in the nation. And Leah Gunning Francis is the vice president and dean of that program. And I was looking at some of the qualifications that Dr. Flowers had as you perhaps get ready to write your project. And he talked about conceptualizing the problem and then building your project around that conceptualization, that you have to be able to clearly articulate what the problem in ministry is, and then build your project around addressing that problem, which is what I did with this book that I'm writing. And I want to look at a few notes with you. Now, this session on paper is supposed to be from 1:30 to 4:30, but I don't intend to talk from 1:30 to 4:30, and I don't think you are prepared to listen to anybody talk from 1:30 to 4:30. And so I will give some remarks, and we can spawn a conversation or a discussion based upon those remarks. And I want to begin to look at when we talk about the conceptualization of the problem. And for me, white evangelicalism is the problem. Because the summer of 2020, a turbulent summer, was plagued by the unrelenting COVID-19 pandemic, if you can recall, the viral video clips of George Floyd lynching by Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, and the execution of 25-year-old unarmed jogger Ahmaud Arbery by two white supremacist vigilantes in Georgia, along with the constant news coverage of Breonna Taylor, a Black woman who was murdered while sleeping by white Louisville police officers who mistakenly raided her home. These events piled on the already seemingly endless video series featured on social media platforms and traditional media news outlets of Black people's mistreatment at the hands of whites, along with the historical abuses suffered, the effects of which still live in the epigenetic memory of Black people. That summer, it pushed the Black community to its psychological and spiritual breaking point. Exacerbating the problem further, the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary's affiliates of the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the largest white evangelical institution in America, had declared critical race theory inconsistent with biblical theology and therefore would not be including it in their theological curricula. Even to the protests of some Black students and faculty members of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. These events sparked protests around the globe. People of all races and ethnicities joined in solidarity with the Black community and taken to the streets in massive marches and demonstrations. Historical precedent suggests that without these protests, it is not likely that any of the perpetrators would have been held accountable by the judicial system, as those white police officers in Louisville, Kentucky, have yet to face justice. During this time, most Black churches were worshiping virtually. And many of you on this call are in the position of pastoral ministry. You were worshiping virtually. And perhaps for the first time, many Black pastors were forced into social relevancy by the glaring problem of white supremacy, which has shamelessly reared its ugly head and stared them in the face, challenging the content of the gospel they had become accustomed to preaching. And they had to do it openly, not within the privacy of their own churches, but on social media platforms where everybody could listen and witness. It was the burning issue of the day. It was the elephant in the room. It could not be ignored as their congregants looked to receive a word from heaven concerning this situation to which they felt vulnerable. They thought, I could be the next George Floyd. Breonna Taylor could easily have been me. I am an avid jogger. Would I suffered a similar fate as Ahmaud Arbery? Each Sunday morning during the pandemic, as we sheltered in place, I had an opportunity to watch online my fellow African American clergy persons preach to their virtual congregations. And in my opinion, some pastors effectively delivered the word of God after the tradition of the biblical prophets, taking to task systemic racism that dominated Black people and white evangelicalism that provided the biblical justification for it. Others, however, appear to be homiletically confused. They knew that they needed to speak to the situation, but didn't seem to know how. Many of them existentially knew the reality of racism because they, as well as their family members and some of their parishioners, had experienced firsthand its dehumanizing sting. They were also aware of the historical patterns where innocent Blacks suffered at the hands of white supremacy, but in their consternation, they agonized over how to deal with it. They recognized that Black domination of Black people was morally reprehensible, thus assuming the appropriate response was to address it from a moral perspective. Many of them chose not to use the preaching moment to tackle the issue, but during their pastoral remarks, either before or after the sermon, during which time they expressed moral outrage over white domination of Black people. And those who attempted to deal with it homiletically selected texts from the Bible from which to preach, but struggled how to allow these texts to speak to the social injustices perpetrated against Black people. They therefore interjected into the sermons statements and narrative expressing moral outrage, though they were often inconsistent with the selected texts as well as the sermon themselves. Though the sermon may address social moral issues, it is primarily a theological document that's supposed to address problems from a theological perspective. School teachers, college professors, counselors, parents, motivational speakers, life coaches, friends, and even pastors in a counseling context may offer moral advice for spiritual or social dilemmas. Psychologists suggest psychological remedies to problems. Sociologists provide analysis and solutions from a sociological perspective, and the same is true with historians, philosophers, economists, politicians, and others. But the Christian sermon, while it may incorporate all of the above from time to time, concerns itself primarily with a biblical response to these issues flowing from a theological analysis of the problem. And the reason so many of my African American clergy colleagues struggle to address the problem of social injustice sermonically was because too many of them were too steeped in white evangelical theology. This creates in African American pastors what Raphael Warnock, United States Senator and pastor of the Ebenezer Church of Atlanta, Georgia, he labeled it the divided mind. He captures the essence of their internal struggles as such. He writes, the divided mind of Black Christianity, that is, faith profoundly shaped by white evangelicals focused on individual salvation, piety, yet conscious of the contradiction of slavery, and therefore focused also on socio-political freedom, protests. He continues, as an instrument of salvation through Jesus Christ, is the mission of the Black church to save souls or to transform the social order? White evangelical theology provides no biblical hermeneutic, no scriptural exegesis, no theological urgency for prophetic preaching or social justice ministry in the face of oppression and domination. White evangelical theology straitjackets and hamstrings even the most gifted Black homiletician, causing them to struggle to construct prophetic messages that speak to social injustice. Many of these pastors were celebrated across the nation as great preachers and are in demand as evangelists and conference speakers, but struggled to construct sermons that prophetically address the blatant injustices that victimize Black people instigated by white supremacy. This brings to mind Reverend John Jasper, one of the most celebrated preachers of the slavery Reconstruction era. Not all enslaved Africans who received the call to preach by God to enter the preaching ministry were privileged to pursue that call. For their calling first had to be approved by their white owner. William Hatchard, John Jasper's contemporary and his biographer, explained it this way. When the master of a Negro preacher allowed him to preach, it was an endorsement, acceptable and satisfactory wherever the man went. If they thought he was all right at home, he could pass muster elsewhere. In some instances, a man who had no inkling of a call on his life to preach, let alone a desire to preach, was called into the ministry by his white owner. The men who had garnered deference and respect among the enslaved community and had proven themselves to be loyal to their masters were likely candidates to receive a call to the preaching ministry by their white owners. The admiration and the veneration they enjoyed in their communities were heightened by adding the title Reverend. Through them, the white owners often solidified their control over the enslaved community. And John Jasper was one such person who credited his master for his call into the preaching ministry. John Jasper admitted while he was preaching, Master Sam Hargrove called me to preach the gospel. He was my old master and he started me out with my message. This is John Jasper, one of the most celebrated Black preachers of the slavery Reconstruction era. After the Civil War, the defeated South nursed its wounds. Southern cities, including Richmond, smoldered in ruins and devastation. Hospitals in Virginia were filled with Confederate soldiers recuperating from their physical, psychological, and spiritual injuries they sustained in the war. Union troops who fought to emancipate the enslaved had also sustained massive injuries and were hospitalized, including hundreds of Black soldiers. Rather than ministering to the wounded who had risked their lives for his liberation, John Jasper volunteered to minister to the Confederate soldiers who fought to keep him enslaved, pledging the lost cause mantra, the South will rise again and reign, reinstituting slavery just as Jesus had risen from the dead and now reigns supreme. Hatcher recounts how well these suffering Confederate combatants received Jasper as he ministered to them in hospitals that would have refused him medical care had he become ill. Hatcher said, these sufferers heard him with undying interest. No wonder they liked him. His songs were so mellow, so tender, so reminiscent of the Southern plantation and of the homes from which these men came. It could not be said too often, he writes, that John Jasper was the white man's preacher. Indeed, he was the white man's preacher. Though the institution of slavery forbade him to learn to read, not to mention the opportunity to go to school and study, he received his theological tutelage from white Southern Baptist evangelical preachers. John Jasper never wrote down any of his sermons on paper, but he preached them so routinely that understudies captured them for publication. Of Jasper's sermon collection left behind for historical consideration, in none of them did he ever mention the evils of the institution of slavery to which he had been a victim for the first 50 years of his life. There is no challenge to white people who flock to hear him preach to repent of the sin of white domination of Black people and exploitation and a call to racial equity. His preaching did not take to task the carnage his fellow freedmen across the South endured at the hands of white terrorist gangs during Reconstruction. There is no biblical-based critique of the government reneging on the promised 40 acres and a mule as a feeble attempt to remunerate the freedmen for 243 years of labor that he and his foreparents rendered that made America a global economic powerhouse. 4 million freedmen were put off the plantations with no place to go. Yet, Jasper largely centered his preaching on salvation of the soul in a metaphysical sense, while ignoring how the biblical salvation might bring physical liberation and equality within history. Or he preached some irrelevant topic designed to amuse and entertain, like dim 7 women, taken from Isaiah 4:1, or the stone cut out of the mountain, taken from Daniel 2:45, or his most famous sermon, the sun do move and the earth am square. In other words, his preaching was devoid of the prophetic dimension that was desperately needed to challenge systems of domination beneath which he and the African American community suffered. On the other hand, during that same era, there were others like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Henry Highland Garnett, and others, preaching according to the tradition of the biblical prophets. So you have 2 extremes. You have Frederick Douglass on one hand, and you have John Jasper on the other. E.A. Randolph, another of Jasper's biographers, tells the story of the only recorded meeting between John Jasper and Frederick Douglass, 2 of the most famous Black preachers of that era. Randolph recounts, the last time the Honorable Frederick Douglass was in Richmond, he called on John Jasper. Douglass had never had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Jasper. Douglass, I engaged a ministerial colleague during that time on his Facebook post. He wrote, I've been preaching about social justice matters for weeks now, and I'm tired of it. It's time to get back to the preaching of the gospel. I commented on his post, what is the gospel? To which he responded, the proclamation of the total sufficiency of Jesus Christ, who demonstrated his love for humanity through his vicarious death, burial, and resurrection for our eternal salvation. I responded, was this the content of the gospel that Jesus preached according to the Bible? He did not reply to my query, but 3 days later, he inboxed me on my Facebook page asking for my cell number so that we might have a more serious conversation about the matter. He called me within moments after I inboxed him my number. He started the conversation by saying, "Doc, you really blew my mind with your question about the content of Jesus's preaching." He continued, "I have a Master of Divinity and a Doctor of Ministry degree, and this is the first time I seriously considered this question. Jesus was the original gospel preacher," he said, "and though he instructed Nicodemus that everyone who believes on me will have eternal life, his gospel was not believe in the death, burial, and resurrection for the forgiveness of sin for salvation." He says that's a Pauline invention, which is legitimate, but what did the master preach? What was the gospel according to him? He said, "Man, your question made me go back and re-examine the gospel from Jesus's perspective. Maybe I had been preaching the gospel when applying the biblical text to social justice issues, but didn't know it." For many years, this seasoned African-American pastor that perhaps everybody on this call knows, pastor of a significant Black church of size and importance in his city, as well as countless other Black clergy persons, understood the gospel from a white evangelical vantage point. This view of the gospel understands Jesus as the Messiah sent from God to save humanity from personal sin, and thus focusing most of its attention on the final 4 days of the story of Jesus, that is his suffering, death, and resurrection, or to the isolated instances in the Bible when Jesus comes to the rescue of someone facing a dire personal need. Though Jesus' teaching ministry and his practical ministry were originally purposed to transform communities by empowering the most vulnerable, white evangelicalism strips away the historical context within which Jesus ministered and within which Jesus's ministry unfolded, placing it in a timeless vacuum, making them individualistic, thus gutting them of social relevance. This perspective diminishes Jesus' ministry to meeting only personal needs, be they spiritual or physical. Accordingly, in their view, systemic sins of domination that are held in place by social structures stand beyond Jesus' ministry focus. Such a theological rubric is woefully inadequate to empower the Black church to continue the biblical tradition of resisting domination. Robert P. Jones, in his book, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, and by the way, I suggest that all of us read that. In that book, he primarily confronts Christians about the brutal history upon which white Christianity was founded and emerged in America. His aim was to educate them on how their predecessors wove into the fabric of their Christian expression theologies that justify the supremacy of whiteness and the inferiority of Blackness, and how those ideologies remain in place today. This book that I'm working on, however, is directed toward Black Christians to demonstrate to them the chilling reality that the Black church in America has largely adopted white evangelical theology to inform their ministries, and by doing so embrace a racist ideology that has historically energized white domination of Black people. White evangelical theology controls most Black churches by defining for them the nature of God, the identity of Jesus, the content of the gospel, and the function of the church. It has historically imposed upon the Black church its biblical hermeneutic, its scriptural exegesis, its cultural morality, and thereby reduced the Black church to a mere echo chamber of the white church promoting the needs and values of the white community to the negation of its own. And so the Black church, we have to have a conversation about the theology that has informed our ministry. And I want to open this thing up so we can have a conversation about it. You know, perhaps somebody in this group wrote down a question or a thought that they might have, or even push back against the whole notion of white evangelicalism. Some might think white evangelicalism is okay. And it has benefited and blessed the church. Whatever your conversation is, whatever your thoughts are, we can have a conversation about it.
I believe from one perspective, while we're speaking social justice, it also turns, like when you mentioned Raphael Warnock, to a political perspective. And many pastors or many people who make above 150K are actually Republicans. So when it swings to the political side, which we are still speaking when we're talking changing social order, from that Republican side, the white evangelicals have taken over that party. So if you look at Ralph Reed and that switch from when they were Democrats to in the 2000s in support of George Bush, that switch over to Republican, and although many Blacks term it or use it, even Black pastors, to say conservative, but they're speaking socially conservative, but then there's a swing towards politics. And I think that's where I won't say got lost, but I'll say that's where we got mixed up in the process, because the switch from Blacks being Republican, that happened with Martin Luther King. So there are still many Black pastors who are speaking about social conservatism, but still are suggesting that, whereas they mean fiscal conservatives. So there's a mix in there in terms of there's a switch which already happened in the 60s, but many people still hold on to that or use that to deem it as social conservatism.
Okay. Well, actually,
I'm sorry.
Ralph Reed that you mentioned is a later iteration. It actually started earlier than that with Reagan and Jerry Falwell.
Yes.
If you can recall, in 1970, I believe, is where we got the Roe versus Wade verdict, legalizing abortion. It was right 10 years later, in 1980, is when Jerry Falwell rose up with the moral majority and really took over. That's when white evangelicalism took over the Republican Party.
But that base, like rebel rousers, they were still there up until 2000. And it was really like someone, I think it was Zell Miller, and this is coming out of Georgia. And he was avoiding something he did. Let's say he was avoiding prosecution, to put it mildly. And I'll just say part of his deal, I'll find the article and I'll put it in the chat. But that whole, so whereas like the people that we hear now, they used to be Democrats. So you're right, especially when you start talking about Lee Atwater and different things like that in the late 60s and the late 70s, but then moving, this is specifically in the 2000s. So then you move into what is going on, you know, right now. Yes, it's been happening all of the time. And yes, it's always occurred from a policy perspective, just even with definitions and the way things are used. But what is going on now is that wave, and what they're doing, they ran into a contradiction, of course, with 45. And instead, what they pushed is like still listen to God, but still listen to Trump, to be present and current. So then you also have to look at the things that he said, but then you're still talking on a larger scale in general when you are speaking of social justice. So I do agree with you.
Yeah.
I'll find it for you though.
Well, Trump became the voice of God.
Exactly. And that's Ralph Reed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, somebody else was getting ready. Chestnut. Quinzel has his hand up. Okay,
Sir, he's having some technical issues, so
okay,
he just got kicked out. We're trying to get him back in.
okay. Well, Sister Hall has her hand up.
Yes. Thank you so much, brother, for this thorough re-enlightenment. And it's really a challenging subject matter that you presented to us. And it kind of took my mind back to an original topic that I had contemplated focusing on for my project. And I shared it early this morning. And the title of the topic is, how does our former and present religious mentoring relationships and indoctrination influence our present prophetic voice? And I've happened upon this book right here. I won't say I happened upon it. The Holy Spirit guided me to it. And I don't know, whether all of us in our class are familiar with it. But I saw the name Lumpkin on it, and I thought about our location in Lumpkin's jail, and then one aspect in it, and I'd like to hear what you're elaborating on. It says, the slave Bible represented a false and controlled narrative based on religion. It was published for the purpose of limiting education and information and maintaining control of a population. Even now, we are all unwilling recipients of a narrative controlled and disseminated by a few powerful people to further their own agendas. Let us understand and avoid the dangers this time. Let us keep digging for the truth until we hit the rock. And what you were sharing today, you were hitting and striking hard on the rock. And I just wanted to thank you for your elaboration and just hear what you have to say.
Appreciate it.
Appreciate you.
This is Quinzel. I'm able.
Yes, sir.
I got kicked out. Going back to my sister Sanson's previous comments, Republican and Democrat and Independent are very complex because people go to certain parties for certain reasons historically, and I say that as a person who's made over 150,000 and I've had voted for a Republican before. I voted for John McCain. Understanding my background being a military officer, and in the military, we are not allowed to have open ties to a political party. And that's why you saw Colin Powell, a Republican, and it was because back then the Republican Party was supporting defense. And so you have a lot of especially black officers, would vote for Republicans at the national level, and at the local level, the state level, they would vote for Democrats. And many of them would call themselves independents rather than either D or R. That was the last time, John McCain was the last time I voted for a Republican. Now, I've supported, campaigned, walked door to door for Democrats. As a young man in college, I walked door to door for Democrats. But the problem becomes with the parties is you can find fault on both sides of the party, and you wind up having selecting the party that has the least amount of fault or is doing the most for people that look like you or your circle. So I just wanted to articulate that we got to hold all the politicians to a standard where they're supporting people that not only look like us, but people in general. The Republicans have went off the reservation, And so it's easier now for all of us who have any moral conscience to go and support the Democrats, from my perspective. But the Democrats, like the mansions and the cinemas, must be held accountable for their lack of empathy for people in general that don't look like the Caucasians. I just put it that way. And my final remark would be that, like I said, when you look at people like Colin Powell and others, we have to remember that it really goes back to the context and the background of where people come from. Because I sat as a Army officer, the Black Army officer, I sat on a group that was meant to try to change race relations within the military. And there were other African-American officers there, and they had no idea of the plight of African-Americans in our country, because they grew up in a culture where everything was protected. And a lot of times they served overseas where it was very blended. And so they had no clue of the challenges that African Americans go through in the United States. And they were treated a lot better overseas. And so my final remark is, we have to educate people and pull off the tarp so everyone can see what's happening, because Black people didn't just start getting shot by the police. I promise you. Growing up in Philadelphia, I don't know a person my age that hasn't got beaten up by the police. But now with a cell phone, everything is becoming visible and illuminated. Thank you.
Reverend Jones.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Williams, for your enlightenment. And I'm from the African American Episcopal Zion Church, the Church of Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass. And we're African Americans, we're Africans. Our descents are from Africa. And we are called the Freedom Church. And that's instilled in us. We're gonna do church the African or Black or African American way, and we don't even as far, because we have a board of bishops, and that's the directive of the tradition. I was on a call last night with Dr. Al Sharpton and Dr. Richardson, which is the president of the trustees of Virginia Union, and they were calling, just what you're talking, ministers, Black ministers, to come together and get people to write their senators for this voting rights thing that will hurt our people in a holistic way. And what you said, what you gave is awesome, absolutely right. And I just can't wait till you and Dr. Kennedy finish that book so I can get it. So I just pray God for you. And this is rich, very rich. And it's the truth. You just sit back and look. It's the truth. Thank you, sir.
DJ, you got your hand up.
So I'm gonna change direction a little bit. One of the things that you said that particularly caught my attention was the reference and self-identification as a Black Christian versus a Christian who happens to be Black. I first became aware of that concept during the MDiv pursuit, where I had an African professor who, ironically enough, was the only professor of color at that institution, but who had wrote that, and this is neither to defend or oppose, just to bring context, he didn't know he was Black till he came to the United States. Mm-hmm. In his country, he was just whatever his tribe was or whatever his family identified as structurally, sociologically. And the only other place we could have thought that to be a thing would have been in India, where it was more of a caste than race. And in South Africa, where it was like segregation on steroids, right? And so his approach to the ideology was, I'm not a Black Christian. I didn't even know what it meant to be Black until I came to the United States where they make the differentiation. I am a Christian who has a darker hue. And to him, it was and to most Africans for that matter, it was a sense of unity. Where I once traveled to South Africa, which was amazing. And after like a week, I had to remind myself I couldn't just hop on a bus and drive up the block and go to my grandma's house. It was just that welcoming. And when I made that mention to them, their response wasn't on a cultural or racial level. Their response was on a theological one. They said, we're all Christian. Should we not be like we're always at home with each other? And it blew me away. I never really thought of it that way. And then they went on further to say that you all find so many things to separate you. For the example, you think you're so far away because you're 24 hours by flight. But what we think is it's the waters that don't separate us. It's the waters that keep us connected. Like the blood keeps your vessels connected in your body. And that's dope. And so when you think of it that way, I would never disown or deny my Blackness, because in many ways it helps me see the gospel through a different lens. And it gives me a voice in which to help other people see the oppressions, the differences, and the nuances that make us uniquely who we are, and subsequently show us who we're not. But in the same respect, there should be, to some degree, a collective theological identity that supersedes all the eclectic divides that we as a people have come to accept. I don't know where that line and that balance is, but I would like to hear your thoughts on that perception, that ideology.
Okay, here's my thoughts. That all theology, particularly in the West, in the United States, is contextual. There is no such thing as a standard theological position. All of them are contextual. And what I argue is that the context out of which theological constructs emerge is out of the context of the domination system within which we are all, whether we are on the bottom rung or the top, we are all in this together. And it is out of these rungs where our theological position and constructs emerge. For example, you have Black theology. Black theology emerged from a Black context, where people who are Black people who occupy what we call the bottom rung of this hierarchical system. Black theology emerged from that as a response to oppression and domination. And so you have James Cone emerging, doing theology from a bottom up rather than a top down hermeneutic. What I mean by that, interpreting the text from the vantage point of the oppressed, rather than trying to understand the text top down from the vantage point of the oppressor. So you have Black theology emerging from this domination system hierarchical structure. You have womanist theology emerging, because this womanist theology is pushing back against sexism and domination. Black theology pushes back against domination and racism. And then you even have a liberation theology that came out of Latin America, their oppressed class. These are theologies that emerge out of social structures, historical context. You even have now a queer theology where the LGBTQ community are saying, we are being discriminated against in this hierarchical domination structure. And our theological position is pushing back against it. And then you have white evangelical theology. Whereas all of the other theologies are pushing back against oppression, white evangelical theology is keeping oppressive structures in place. So we all have these theological constructs emerging from the same social order. And so to see myself as a Black Christian implies that I understand where I am within this social construct. But to see myself as a Christian who happens to be Black is to ignore the social construct out of which my theology emerged. And as a Black man in America, I can't afford to do that. Because to negate my Blackness is to say that white theology is the standard, and it is to acquiesce to that standard. And I refuse to do that. And so when I understand what you're saying, DJ, that people abroad, many of which don't even know they're Black until they get here, then they become aware of it. Because it was not even a thing. As a matter of fact, race was not even a thing. According to several writers, it was not even a thing until we got here to the United States. They made it a thing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so within that context, I must see myself as a Black Christian rather than a Christian who happens to be Black. Because to do that means that I have embraced white evangelical theology as the standard.
So let me ask you one question. This is just to play devil's advocate. I already know the answer to this, so don't get mad at me. I'm not arguing if this is the answer. So would you then say that to some degree, it's possible to interpret these theological movements as an eisegeted concept imposed upon the text to defend a sociological ill versus an eschatological identity of what it meant to properly interpret the scriptures for a people who identify themselves with God's word?
Well, I don't think it is an imposition. I really don't. Because to imply that it is an imposition is to suggest that white evangelicalism is the standard. You know, and I have to push back against that, because when you look at Jerome Ross, I don't know if Ross is teaching in this program or not. Jerome Ross argues that the Bible was written from 6 periods of oppression: Egyptian oppression, Canaanite oppression, Assyrian oppression, Babylonian oppression, Persian oppression, and Roman oppression. 6. These were Hebrews who are oppressed, writing to other Hebrews who are in oppression. So if I'm going to understand the Bible from the model from which it was written, I have to understand it from the perspective as a document written by and for people of oppression. Living in the United States, we are a people of oppression. And so for me to understand the Bible from the rubric or from the hermeneutic of oppression is more consistent with the Bible itself, because it is a book written by the oppressed to the oppressed. So now when you take white evangelicalism, they take the Bible and somehow they have contorted it into a book that benefits the oppressor that's against the oppressed. How do you flip it like that? How all of a sudden did Jesus of Nazareth, who was born poor in Galilee, who came and said, one of my agenda is to set the captives free, and he took side with the oppressed. He died on Calvary at the hands of Roman domination. Jesus was an oppressed man. How all of a sudden did the Jesus of the Bible, who took side with the oppressed, in America today, who now takes sides with Donald Trump? Are you kidding me? He has now flipped sides. He is no longer on the side of the poor. He's now on the side of the oppressors. You know, and so I don't think it is an imposition at all, DJ, to talk about these theological rubrics, whether it's Black theology, liberation theology, feminist theology, a womanist theology. I think that they are more consistent with the original theology of the Bible. Dewey got his hand up.
Well, I know Tracy had hers up before me. She's had
Okay.
hers up a long
Sorry.
time.
Okay, I didn't see you, Tracy. I'm sorry.
I'm still shouting right now. I'll wait until you finish.
Well, I was going to say, Dr. Williams, I come, well, first of all, I can't wait for your book. And I'm ordering Robert Jones' book as soon as we get off.
Oh, yeah.
Because I want to get it. But I want to come and confess that my history is a history where I grew up in a church that taught two things: get saved and get right, so you can go to heaven. You know, say personal salvation and then live right. And so all of the things about living right had to do with these personal minor things that were raised that everybody kind of stumbles over and never confronted social injustice that the oppressor was using. White evangelical, I think, evangelicalism, and I hate that term evangelicalism because nothing evangelical about what they're doing that helps me. But what they present is not a gospel that is about doing what's right. It's about how do we maintain power and control. And it started off, how do we keep the Black slaves tame and with their rebellion down? How do we keep them in their place? That was at the heart of the initiation of their evangelical move. And I think that comes forward, and we see that in all of the things. I was literally shouting your whole presentation because you really laid it on. And like I said, I can't wait for your book. I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Tracy?
Thank you, Dr. Williams. I'm having a similar reaction to what my colleague just said. I wonder if you could talk a little bit, and I apologize if I missed it. I was having trouble connecting on Zoom today. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how the infusion of individualism plays into this versus a communal way of being and thinking. I'm growing greatly concerned because a part of what has happened, in my opinion, and I'd like your criticism on this, is that while integration had many benefits, it also had many costs. And those costs include the splitting of our communities based on classism in ways that always existed, but we didn't have the opportunity to actually leave one another, right? So I grew up in the South. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a segregated time when I was born. And so I grew up in a neighborhood that was all Black, and it was the whole gamut of class in one neighborhood because we all had to live together. As we moved into this integrated way of being, which came really not for our benefit, but for the benefit of others, in my opinion, as we came into that, then our community began to scatter in ways that caused those who did not have economic progression on their side to be pulled together and not being able to pull up the whole village as was possible when we all lived together. I hope I'm making sense what I'm saying. I think about that scripture in the Babylonian exile when the Israelites were taken, and the text says that they took the smiths and the artisans and the warriors and the visionaries. They didn't take everybody. Right. They took the gifted people, right? And I see that playing out over and over and over again in our lived realities. When they have schools that they'll take the gifted kids, the accelerated intellectual kids out of Black communities and place them into white schools. I'm one of those kids that happened to. They'll take those who are excelling and offer the opportunity to live in communities without the burden of those who have been oppressed or who for other reasons have not been able to advance. And so then we end up with these pools of poverty that we ourselves are separated from. So when I think politically When I talk about politics, I don't talk about it just in terms of Republican and Democrat and independent. I think politics is the way we choose to live our lives. And we have moved into this mindset where we vote for those who can advance us, rather than we vote for those who can uplift the least of us, right? Which means sometimes I'm voting for policies that may cost me more because I'm in a position to pay more than someone else who is beneath me. I'm fighting for a living wage, not because I need a living wage, but because I am a disciple of an Afro-Semitic rabbi who says I have a responsibility to those who can't do what I can do. And so I'm going to leave it there, but you like have fired me up with this because I think it's much deeper than that. And I too have traveled the continent. I've heard all the messages about how white is just a color there. But when I go to the churches there, the Jesus on the wall is white. The money is black, the statues are black, the ads are black. The only place I see white is Jesus. And that's a reflection of the colonization that happened to them, just like it happened to us in a different form, but colonization in both ways and our internalization of that. I just want to hear what you have to say about that. Well, I'm sorry, but I got all fired up from you started it. I'm just saying.
No, I mean, I'm being blessed by what you are saying about it. You know, I mean, what can you say except that speaks to this whole ideology of, in my opinion, that the difference between I'm a Black American and I'm an American who happens to be Black. That is who I am as a descendant of Africa influences how I'm treated as an American. We just heard Mitch McConnell, the senator from Kentucky. He made that comment about voting, that Black people voted at the same rates of Americans.
Yes.
As if to suggest we're not American. And that comes right on the heels. It speaks to what was Toni Morrison, who said, everything that's not white in America is hyphenated.
Yes.
You know, you don't say European hyphen Americans, but you say African hyphen Americans, you know, Latino hyphen American, Asian hyphen American. But when we start talking about white people, there is no hyphenation, because in their minds, whiteness is America.
Absolutely, absolutely.
No.
And if I can push you just a little bit further, Dr. Williams, and then I'm going to be quiet about it. I think the threat of this is not just a political one to our democracy, but it is a threat to our church. The reason I say that is because this embodiment of individualism has caused the Black church to move away from communal empowerment to prosperity gospel. It has caused us to move away from caring for the least of these to a salvific rendering that suggests the more we have, the greater access to God we have. It's antithetical to the gospel, and it is the core of white supremacy, whether you put it in the White House or whether you put it in the pulpit. And I'm concerned about it because if we ever needed the church to stand up, we need the church to stand up now. And this watering down of the gospel to suggest that somehow God's favor, that God is a God of favoritism, then a God of favor is destroying us and weakening our ability to confront the evils that are before us in the White House and in the streets.
Tracy, are you a pastor?
I've been a pastor a long time. I'm at a denominational level now, but I mean, I've been waiting for what you were saying, so I'm just really passionate about this. I'm just sorry.
No, I know. I'm just asking you a personal question publicly. You pastor a church?
I pastored a church for 10 years. I
Okay.
resigned from pastoring last December because I hold a denominational office
Okay.
and it was just too much.
Okay.
But that's how I pastored the church. That is a sacred launching pad for communal engagement and resistance. And if we don't do that for ourselves, if we buy into this gospel that has been watered down and creates for us a God who is just a proverbial slot machine, then what do we say about our history and what do we say about our future?
Thank you, Tracy. Bishop Jones.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blackman. I appreciate that, and the reactions were all across the board. It would just lighten up. I'm thankful that the womanist movement has they're a part of the big picture and not just put off to the side. Thank you so much for my sisters. I came out of the civil rights. I'm telling on my age. I was there both with Martin Luther King and the reaction of the church. Actually, when I saw the church at that time, it didn't seem to have equal reaction to what was happening to it. I had made a decision to choose Islam because I thought it had greater identity and it had a greater reaction. Today, the church has lost the ability to be a threat. This is almost going back to, there are two different type of churches that's out here. And it seems like the church that has the greatest reaction is the church that is not seen. So I think that I appreciate everything that you said, especially going back to Frederick Douglass and to, was it Jasper Williams?
No, John Jasper.
John Jasper. Okay. And I think that we have that dualism right now that's not helping us. I wrote a paper that said that there is no passive way out. I thank God for Dr. Martin Luther King, but I don't see how nonviolence. I think that they are pushing the envelope every day about voter repression, about critical race theory. And these are things that we have got to be more visible, and we have got to offer more of a response and a reaction that is not just intellectual, because we can see what has happened to America is because there is something going on in the streets. The church, again, Dr. Blackman, we have to be communal. We have to have that presence of mind and that community push against all of this oppression, because these Republicans, white evangelicals, right, they are there to take away what little that we have been afforded. Somehow the church has got to move out of this. I don't know what the term is, pretty church or intellectual church. We've got all our needs met, and we keep on being purchased with more of the. Let me sum it up like this: we cannot overcome the master with the master's tools.
Well, Bishop, that's one of the issues that James Cone, who is, one of my heroes, one of my theological heroes. One of the issues James Cone had during nearing the end of his life is that he had some regrets about how he presented Black theology. He presented it in a way that it was out of reach for the person in the pew. And he relied on the clergy persons who went through the academy to take the message of Black theology and Black liberation theology and somehow take it back to the pew so that it can influence how the church, the congregation, understood reality. He has some regrets. He said, I was too high above the average pew person, and my message did not get to them the way I would like to have hope that it would have gotten to them. And so those of us right now, I don't know if we have any Bud and James Cones in this in this group or not. But I do know that we have to start writing, Bishop. You asked what we should do. One of the things we can do is to begin to write, to articulate the James Cones, the J.D. Otis Roberts, the John Kennys, to be able to articulate these guys in a way that our pew can understand it. Use language that our pews can understand. You know, I wrote The Bible is Black History, and I wrote it with the language on purpose so that anybody sitting in any of our churches can pick it up and start reading it and get it. And so I think that's one of the things, Bishop, that we can do as leaders in the African American church, is to start writing and write in a way where our people can get it, so that we don't make the mistake that Cone says that he made, that making it intellectually inaccessible to the average pew person. Reverend Jones?
I agree with you. As you were saying that, I was getting hit with, how do we galvanize the young people that are more, how do we use anger to move us off the perch, and not become destructive, but become constructive, and a voice? How do we get that to a place where that just because of, I mean, why shouldn't we be angry? You know, how do we get our people to become angry enough to be more responsive, and not only to just us writing? I definitely agree to that. How do we galvanize a generation so that they do not become complacent like some of us have, because we have brought the American dream. We have brought the ideology that we should let the bystander effect, let somebody else do it. Let somebody else come to the forefront. That we keep on pushing programs that this country is amused at, that we can come up with another program that means absolutely nothing, that will cause no changes at all. I agree with you. Thank you so much for that.
Well, Bishop, let me say this, and then we'll move on to Reginald and then Quinzel. It's already happening with Black Lives Matter. They're already doing it. Leah Gunning Francis wrote a piece about what went down in Missouri when, what's the young man's name who got shot some years ago?
Michael Brown Jr.
Michael Brown.
Michael Brown. When Michael Brown got shot, Leah Gunning Francis did a magnificent piece. I'm gonna think of the name of the book in a minute. Well, in her
Faith
work,
in Ferguson.
Faith in Ferguson. She went to Ferguson and she studied what took place and how it unfolded. And she argues that it was Black Lives Matter that took the lead in those protests and demonstrations, and the church followed Black Lives Matter. Pastors down there in Ferguson humbled themselves. There was some resistance at first, but they humbled themselves and jumped on the bandwagon that Black Lives Matter was driving. Don't underestimate Black Lives Matter, because what Black Lives Matter did in the summer of 2020, they did something that King was unable to do, that Sharpton hasn't done, that Jackson hasn't done. Black Lives Matter galvanized people worldwide across ethnic and racial lines, brought them together in a demonstration that created substantive, transformative change in the United States. So, Bishop, it is already happening. The question is, will the church humble itself enough to allow Black Lives Matter to have this leadership, and we come alongside with our resources and help move along? We don't have to be in the driver's seat.
Amen.
Black Lives Matter got this. They really do. If we can come alongside them, with our resources, with our power, with our influence, things can happen, Bishop. Things can happen. Because you talk about anger, they're already furious.
Good. I do appreciate that. I guess my thought was that the church should be the one that's taking the lead in the community action. I agree with you wholeheartedly that Black Lives Matter has done it, and they're doing it, and we should not fail in supporting them. We should be, as this is a white phrase, in lockstep with them and everything that they do, and welcome any other movement that supports that. And there's so many other movements, as you have said, there's so many other theologies that's rising up, womanist, queer, and all those kind of things like that. I think that this is a time of welcoming and embracing. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams.
Thank you for your comments.
Now, I just want to, what's the name of the book from Jones? All I got was Jones.
Is which book now?
There's something about
White Too Long, right?
White Too Long.
White Too Long.
Robert P. Jones.
Robert P. Jones. That's all I got. Thank you. Bless you.
Dr. Williams, I do
Dr.
want to
Williams,
add.
May I say just very, very quickly, you were excited about our cohort member, Sister Tracy's comments. Let me connect a dot, two dots, please. Just to toot the UCC horn as a fellow UCC and an admirer of her tremendous courage. Our sister, our cohort member, Tracy Blackman, was a pastor in in the surrounding area. Was Christ the King in Florissant or is in Ferguson? But she was one of those pastors. And it was her voice was lifted during the moments around Michael Brown's death. And she was one of those pastors of whom you are speaking. Okay. And it was around that action that that she was elevated to the position that she is now, that she holds now in the United Church of Christ.
Well, Tracy, were you one of the?
Thank you for that.
That Leah.
I just wanted to say, Dr. Williams, I echo what you're saying about Black Lives Matter. I do want to say that the thing that was missing in Black Lives Matter's initial work, which was with Trayvon Martin, that shifted in Ferguson with Michael Brown, I believe, and Leah lived here at the time, we're colleagues, so she was living here, is the presence of clergy with a spirituality that did not require compliance from Black Lives Matter, right? So Black Lives Matter is led by people who have a spiritual base, but don't have a church connection. And the reason that we ended up in that position was because when we went out into the streets of Ferguson, we encountered young people, hundreds of young people who were in the streets already, who had left the church for the most part, for various reasons. Some I know and some I don't. It was the ability of clergy to meet together and say, this is our role. We are keepers of the story. We are defenders of our youth. And we're not going to leave the street and leave our young people there by themselves. And those kinds of submissive acts are not necessarily what is historically lifted up about our civil rights history, though I'm not sure it wasn't the same there. When I look back at the civil rights movement in Birmingham, Alabama, it was the children who were being hosed and the dogs were biting. It was the children who led that movement. It was young people who did the sit-ins and the freedom rides. And so when we tell the story now, we center Dr. King, may his memory always be a blessing, and I honor Dr. King. But there also were the women and the children who were behind that movement as well.
Mm-hmm. And King was 39 when he died. He was a young man doing this. You know, he would have been considered a millennial today.
Mm-hmm.
Out front in this movement, yeah. Well, thank you. Tracy, were you one of the persons that Leah interviewed in her book?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I held the first community meeting for the killing of Michael Brown Jr. The first one was actually held by the NAACP, but it did not allow the people on the ground to speak. And so the next day at my church, we gathered standing room only to begin and did the first march from there. So there was a group of clergy who committed to that. 12 or 15, and we're out there 369 days. But the point I want to make from what you're saying is, first of all, the church mistook a relationship for God with a relationship for the institution. So the church was in the street. They had spirituality, but many of them had walked away from the church or never been introduced to the church in a favorable way. That opportunity still exists for the Black church to make ourselves a neighbor, a friend to those who are in the streets who have never found our brick and mortar to be home.
And you know what? We have a major model in Jesus, because when we start talking about the Gospels, and when you read the Gospels and you come across the word sinners, how Jesus was condemned for hanging out with sinners, if you trace that, the sinners were those who had become fed up with organized religion and had seen the Jewish ruling class in cahoots with the Roman dominators who were complicit in the Jews' domination, particularly the Galileans, who were complicit in that Roman domination. And they saw that. They saw the compulsory temple tax and saw how the Jewish ruling class was living large. And while they struggled to eke out a living, they saw that. Though they still believed in Yahweh, they walked away from the synagogue, they walked away from the temple. They didn't want to have anything to do with organized religion. And it is those people that Jesus hung out with. Now that parallels with what we're dealing with today. People have walked away from the church because they got a problem with the church being steeped in white evangelicalism, where they see it as if it is in cahoots with the oppressor. They see how some clergy persons live large. There's not many of them, but the ones that they do see are so high profile, they think all of them are like that. Most clergy people are dedicated to their churches, dedicated to their communities, and have made tremendous sacrifices. But the ones who are elevated on social media and traditional media, those are enough to put in the heads of those people who have walked away from church that image, to say that all of them are like that. And so we have some opportunities. We have a model in Jesus Christ. That was his crowd. Those were the people he hung out with, and those were the people that he sought to recruit to be members of the kingdom of God. And so, yeah, you're right, Tracy. We do have some opportunities, and we do have a model. In fact, that would be an awesome D-Men project for somebody. But anyway, I digress.
That is my D-Men project.
Okay.
And Dr. Leah has just written a follow-up book, interviewing the faith leaders again.
Yeah.
To say, where are we now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it out?
It's coming out very soon because she's already scheduling book tours.
Okay. All right, Quinzel.
Yes, I was too full of emotion the last time I tried to talk, so I'm gonna try to be more concise this time. One of the things that everybody's talking about is that as a weapon, it's messaging. The white spin things have a way of messaging it that it is received in certain audiences one way and other audiences a different way. And it goes to the point, what is white? What is white? Okay, for people to call somebody white, somebody coming from Europe, okay, they developed that term white, and now they're afraid they're going to lose it. My son, who's a captain station up at West Point, they had a sensing session where they had all the captains together. And one of the captains was bold enough to say that we got to do something before the whites are no longer the majority. And so a Black officer asks, what is white? What makes you white and makes you that value so much higher than me? What is your whiteness that guarantees you to be treated better than anybody else? And of course, he could not answer it. But real quick, I just want to give a couple of examples. One time I was in a mission in the jungles and we came upon some soldiers guarding some POWs, and they were hogtied with piano wire. And I was like, I went ballistic, and I was blown away how you can treat a human being like that. And so when on another mission in Bosnia, where I looked at how neighbors had killed neighbors, and I was like, how could you treat each other like that? And then I had to think back, coming out of the inner city of Philadelphia, I was treated one way when people recognized who I was, and a different way when they didn't. And so being an All-American and playing college basketball, and I can come in the neighborhood and some people would recognize me, some people wouldn't. And I was treated almost like I had no worth at all at first, until they recognized who I was, then all of a sudden I'm special. Or when I was in Fort Benning, me and my friend went into KFC after playing basketball, and the Black people working behind the counter would not serve us. And this is in Columbus, Georgia, deep South, wouldn't serve us. We asked to speak to the manager, and they told the manager we were acting up, we were demanding things. We came back there the next day in uniform. And then when they saw we were officers, their whole demeanor changed. Okay. And so it was Black being discriminated by Blacks because they devalued who we were, and they would defer to white people in the audience or in the room because they were white. But for a Black person, you had to be something special to be treated normal. And so the final point that I want to make is that right now, there is a major fault line that is being broken that could cause a major world war that people are not even seeing. People are not really understanding what's going on in Ukraine, and they don't understand how Russia and China has made a pact, and how China is getting ready to attack Taiwan, and how that's going to draw us into that. And the point is, Black people have been going and fighting wars for hundreds of years and being treated better by the enemies than the people that sent us to war. And so that's one of my projects is focusing on PTSD, because so many people have left who they were on some battlefield, and they were treated so bad when they came back home, whether it's from Vietnam or wherever they were from. And so we have to learn to treat each other with respect, because right now in the inner cities, we got Black people killing Black people like it ain't nothing. You know, and there are people that treat their dogs better than they treat their neighbors. And so we have to learn to be valued and what is valued. That's all I have. Thank you.
Dr. Williams, I wanted to say that, I thought that I grew up in a, fairly radical and conscientized, household. I grew up in North Carolina around SNCC, and I want to say that for me, in many, many ways, God is not static, and the church should not be either. And things should always be in constant movement and even in the evolution. And so, in many ways, Black Lives Matter is the present day iteration of SNCC, and what started at Shaw, Ella Baker, and all of that. And again, women and young people in the forefront, like Ya Ashanti Way in Ghana, and like Deborah and Barack. But for all of that, for all of the social conscious that I thought that I was surrounded with and grew up with, it was not. And this happened in Munich, Germany, in the mid 80s. It was not until my Christology was challenged that I mean when I say challenged, I mean it was shaken to the core. And the text that shook me up to the core and started this radical shift in re-examination of things was Matthew 10:34. Do not think that I have come to bring peace, but I have come with the sword. And that was so antithetical to anything that we can have a conscientized mind. We can be moving toward, as Christians, we can be moving toward what Prince called it the colonized mind, and we can be moving away from it into a decolonized mind. But as Christians, until I think our Christology is shaken and we see the radical and the revolutionary and the resistor that Jesus was, at least that was my experience, then that created for me this total shift. It shifted my anthropology. It shifted everything. When you see Jesus in that Matthew 10:34 moment, you cannot have your salvation cannot just be eschatological. It's got to be a here and now kind of salvation. And I want you, for me, to say something to that in terms of Christology in the Black church, and how our traditional framework and aspect on Jesus, not seeing Jesus as this revolutionary that clearly the whole gospel means for him to be, but particularly how Matthew 10 unfolds and unpacks until it gets to that 10:34. Do not think, don't get it twisted. Do not think that I have come to bring peace, but I have come. And he says he will draw a line in the sand and make us choose from even that which is closest to us to decide which side are we on. So can you please just.
Yeah, that's interesting. You bring up Matthew 10, because right after he says that, he says, I have come to set a son against his father, a daughter against his mother, a mother-in-law against a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. That's interesting, because when you look at systems of domination, which, in my opinion, as I argue throughout the book, that is the issue against which the kingdom of God struggled and contended, against systems of domination. And wherever Jesus saw domination rearing its head, he challenged it. Now, he galvanized these disciples, and one of the things that they are doing is resisting social domination. But you cannot resist social domination and then go home and practice domination. So Jesus says, I have come to turn a son against his father. Now, when you look at the father-son relationship in those days, it was the father who dominated the son. And the son is supposed to submit to the father until the son becomes of age. When that son becomes of age, the relationship between the son and the father is no longer defined by domination. And so Jesus says, at some point in that relationship between father and son has to push back against the domineering control of the father, and the daughter has to push back against the dominating control of the mother, and the daughter-in-law has to push back. Notice, Jesus is always on the side of the dominated in any hierarchical domination relationship. And so that's why Jesus said, I've come to bring a sword, because there will be conflict in any institution where the person on the bottom who has been historically dominated decides, I'm no longer going to submit myself to this dominated role, but I'm going to rise up and demand equity. There is always going to be problem, whether it's in a household, whether it's in a church, whether it's in a corporation, whether it's in a school, whether it's in any organization, because most of our organizations are designed on hierarchical structure. Somebody is on top of the other, dominating that person. And so it's interesting you bring up Matthew 10, because Jesus is saying, wherever there is domination, that is given assent to the demonic. It suggests demonic activity. Because when you look at John Kinney does this, and I talk about it in my book, and I give Walter Wink a lot of credit, but this started with John Kinney, in my opinion, because John Kinney was talking about this in the early 80s. Walter Wink didn't start writing about it until the mid-90s. So John Kinney was talking about, when he talks about the fall in Genesis 3, and he talks about how hierarchy entered into the human experience at the fall, because God created an egalitarian society. Nobody was over anybody and nobody was under anybody. It was not hierarchical. But then after the fall, that's when hierarchy comes, because now you have the serpent at the bottom. Over the serpent, you have the woman. Over the woman, you have the man. So you have this hierarchy at work within society because of the fall. And Kinney says that that fall is a result of demonic deception, and our society has normalized it. We have normalized demonic activity. Even the Apostle Paul, bless his heart, normalized demonic activity when he talks about slave being subjected to your master, woman being subjected to your husband, children being subjected to your parents, citizenry being subjected to the state. Throughout Paul's writing, he advocates system of domination, which in John Kinney's mind normalizes demonic activity. And so wherever it raises its head, it is to be challenged. In Christ, we are a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things have become new. So yeah, I do agree. And that is a life-changing, theological changing passage as you look at Matthew 10. Rosalind? Unmute yourself, we can't hear you. You're muted.
The dialogue that we've been having up to this point has helped me to kind of appreciate why it was that a lot of churches were not on the front line with Black Lives Matter, because the pot can't call the kettle black. That's one thing. And you cannot, when I say you, I'm talking about the church that's still dealing with its in-house demonic activity of oppression. How can, well, this quote that says that you can't solve your problem with the same mind that created it in the first place. Now, we expect that the church supposed to have an answer to something externally that it is not demonstrating that it has the answer for internally. And how do we expect to get the kind of respect from our young people that are out there on the front lines in the manner in which they are out there to welcome us up on the front line with it, when they know that our house is for the, you know, I'm cloaking it, that our houses are so much out of order from all of what was just said about the hierarchies, and, you know, all the different systematic church strongholds that are in place, and how we that have the word that's supposed to be life-changing and supposed to be able to break every chain and destroy every yoke, but we cannot have not figured out how to harness that thing right on in the house where we are.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, how can the church be on the front line of destroying systems of oppression and domination, and then go back to the church and tell women you can't preach and you are subjected to your role in the church? You know, so you're right. We have to get our houses together internally, which is what you're doing here, you know,
Praise
as we
glory.
prepare for ministry. Okay, any other questions or conversations? Because we can just about shut down right now if there's nothing else that we can discuss. Okay, thank you so much for joining. And boy, this was a stimulating conversation, man. I really appreciate each and every one of you. And I look forward. Now, I don't know if I'll be working with this cohort or not. I don't think so. I think it'll be the next cohort that's going to enroll under the Dr. Jeremiah Wright social justice cohort. I'm not sure, but if I am, boy, I would be glad to come alongside and learn from you, and you can get whatever you can from me. It'll be a wonderful, wonderful partnership. But thank you so much. I love you guys, and I wish you the best as you journey through this process.